Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight, we're heading to the heart of Europe, Germany. Now, you might think you know this place. Beer gardens, castles, that one relatives who's really into sausages. But Germany's story goes way deeper than bratwurst and lederhosen. This is a land carved by rivers and shaped by history's most dramatic plot twists. We're talking Roman legions getting absolutely wrecked in dark forests, medieval emperors who couldn't quite keep their kingdoms together, and a 20th century that, well, let's just say Germany wrote some chapters the world would rather forget, then spent decades trying to make things right. From the Rhine Valley to the Baltic coast, from fairy tale forests to industrial powerhouses, tonight we're exploring how geography shaped a nation that's been everything from a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms to the beating heart of modern Europe. So grab a pillow, get comfortable, and let's ease into the surprisingly complicated story of Germany. Trust me, it's way more interesting than you learned in high school. Chapter 1: Ancient Foundations and Geographic Stage. Picture, if you will, a land where the North Sea whispers ancient secrets to sandy shores, while alpine peaks in the south stand like stern guardians watching over centuries of human drama. This is Germany, a country that sits at the very heart of Europe, like that friend who somehow ends up hosting every dinner party, whether they plan to or not. Germany's geographic story begins with its remarkable position as Europe's crossroads, stretching from the Baltic and North Sea coasts down to the foothills of the Alps. This land covers roughly 357,000 square kilometers of surprisingly diverse terrain. To put that in perspective, it's roughly the size of Montana, though with considerably more castles and significantly better public transportation. The northern German plain rolls out like a vast green carpet, dotted with lakes that glaciers carved out during the last ice age. These glaciers were apparently very thorough in their work, leaving behind a landscape so flat that medieval merchants could probably see their destination from several kingdoms away. This northern region, known as the North German Plain, extends from the Netherlands border all the way to Poland, creating what geographers rather poetically call the Great European Plain. Moving southward, the land begins to show more character, rising into the central German uplands. Here, ancient mountains wear down by time create a patchwork of hills, valleys, and plateaus that look like someone crumpled up a map and then smoothed it out again, but not quite completely. The Harz Mountains, the Thuringian Forest, and the Bavarian Forest create a middle belt of Germany that's neither fully northern nor southern, existing in that comfortable geographic middle ground that Germans seem to excel at occupying. The southern reaches rise dramatically into the Bavarian Alps, where peaks like the Zugspitze reach heights of nearly 3,000 meters. These mountains form Germany's southern border with Austria, creating a natural barrier that has influenced trade routes, military strategies, and the migration patterns of both people and ideas for thousands of years. The Alps also provide Germany with its most dramatic scenery, the kind that makes tourists point their cameras frantically while muttering things like, "This can't possibly be real." Germany's river systems tell their own geographic story, with waterways that have shaped human settlement since the earliest tribes arrived. The Rhine, perhaps Germany's most famous river, flows northward from Switzerland through the heart of the country before emptying into the North Sea in the Netherlands. The Rhine Valley has been a corridor of civilization for over 2 millennia, serving as a highway for Roman legions, medieval merchants, and modern industrial barges with equal efficiency. The Elbe River flows northwest from the Czech Republic to the North Sea, draining much of northern Germany and creating the port city of Hamburg, which has been enthusiastically facilitating trade since the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, the Danube begins its journey in Germany's Black Forest region before wandering eastward across Europe, eventually reaching the Black Sea after visiting 9 other countries. The Danube has always been something of an overachiever in the river department. This diverse geography created natural regions that would profoundly influence German cultural and political development. The Rhine Valley became a corridor of Roman influence and later medieval trade. The northern plains proved perfect for agriculture and became the heartland of Germanic tribal confederations. The central uplands provided natural defensive positions and became centres of early German kingdoms, while the Alpine regions created distinct cultural pockets that maintained their own traditions and dialects. Into this geographic stage stepped the earliest known inhabitants, the Germanic tribes. These weren't a single unified people, but rather a collection of tribal groups who shared similar languages, customs, and what archaeologists politely call material culture. The term Germanic itself comes from Roman sources, specifically Julius Caesar and later Tacitus, who used it to describe the various tribal peoples living east of the Rhine River. Archaeological evidence suggests that Germanic-speaking peoples had settled throughout northern and central Europe by the first millennium before the Common Era. These early Germans organized themselves into tribes with names that sound like they were created by medieval fantasy writers: the Cimbri, the Teutones, the Suebi, and the Cherusci, among many others. Each tribe controlled specific territories, often defined by river valleys or mountain ranges, creating a patchwork of small kingdoms that would become a recurring theme in German history. The Germanic tribes lived in what historians call segmentary societies, meaning they were organized into smaller kinship groups that could unite for warfare or major decisions, but otherwise operated independently. Their settlements typically consisted of timber and thatch longhouses that could shelter extended families and their livestock. These weren't the primitive huts that popular imagination might suggest. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated construction techniques and evidence of metalworking, pottery, and textile production. Germanic religion centered around a pantheon of gods who seemed primarily concerned with warfare, wisdom, and the management of natural forces. Woden, known to later Scandinavians as Odin, served as the chief deity, while Thor handled thunder and lightning with characteristic Germanic efficiency. Their religious practices included sacred groves, where they performed rituals that Roman sources describe in terms that suggest the Romans found them both fascinating and slightly horrifying. The Germanic tribes practiced what anthropologists call gift exchange economies, where status came not from accumulating wealth but from giving it away in elaborate displays of generosity. Tribal chiefs gained prestige by hosting feasts, giving weapons to their warriors, and generally demonstrating their ability to redistribute resources. This cultural emphasis on generosity and personal loyalty would later influence medieval concepts of feudalism and noble obligation. Germanic law operated through assemblies where free men could voice their opinions by clashing their weapons against their shields, creating what must have been remarkably noisy legal proceedings. They had no written law codes initially, instead relying on oral traditions and the collective memory of legal precedents. Justice emphasized compensation rather than punishment, with elaborate systems for paying blood money to settle disputes and avoid cycles of revenge. The geographic position of the Germanic lands meant that contact with the Roman Empire was inevitable, and this contact would prove transformative for both societies. The Rhine River became more than just a waterway. It became a cultural frontier that separated the Roman world from what Romans called Germania. This frontier was neither fixed nor impermeable, with constant movement of people, goods, and ideas across the water. Julius Caesar first encountered Germanic tribes during his conquest of Gaul in the 1st century before the Common Era. His account, while obviously biased toward Roman perspectives, provides valuable insights into Germanic society. Caesar described the Germans as larger and more warlike than the Gauls, living in a state of constant military readiness that he found both admirable and concerning. He noted their custom of annual territorial redistribution, where tribes would move to new lands to prevent any group from becoming too attached to specific territories. The most famous early encounter between Romans and Germans occurred in 9 Common Era, when a confederation of Germanic tribes led by a chieftain named Arminius destroyed 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. Arminius had served as an auxiliary in the Roman army and understood Roman tactics, which he used against them with devastating effectiveness. The Roman general Varus lost not only his legions but also his life, leading Emperor Augustus to reportedly wander his palace calling out, "Varus, give me back my legions." This defeat convinced the Romans to abandon plans for conquering Germania beyond the Rhine, instead establishing a defensive frontier along the river. They built a series of fortifications called the Limes Germanicus, a frontier system that included walls, watchtowers, and fortified camps stretching from the Rhine to the Danube. This frontier would remain largely stable for the next 4 centuries, creating a permanent boundary between the Roman and Germanic worlds. Despite this military frontier, contact between Romans and Germans continued through trade, diplomacy, and military service. Many Germanic warriors served in Roman auxiliary units, learning Roman military techniques and organizational methods. Roman merchants crossed the frontier to trade manufactured goods for Germanic amber, furs, and slaves. Germanic tribes often sought Roman support in their conflicts with other tribes, creating complex webs of alliance and obligation. This contact gradually transformed Germanic society, particularly among tribes closest to the Roman frontier. Archaeological evidence shows increasing Roman influence in Germanic settlements, with imported pottery, coins, and luxury goods appearing in tribal centres. Some Germanic chieftains adopted Roman titles and administrative practices, creating hybrid forms of governance that blended tribal customs with Roman organizational techniques. The conversion to Christianity began slowly among the Germanic tribes, initially through contact with Roman missionaries and Christian merchants. However, most tribes maintained their traditional religious practices well into the early medieval period. The process of Christianization would accelerate dramatically in later centuries, but during this early period, Germanic religion remained centered around the traditional pantheon and seasonal festivals. Germanic agricultural practices adapted to their diverse geographic environment, with different tribes specializing in crops suited to their specific regions. Northern tribes focused on cattle and sheep herding, taking advantage of extensive grasslands, while central German tribes developed sophisticated grain agriculture. The southern tribes, closer to Roman influence, began experimenting with Roman agricultural techniques and crop varieties. The tribal political structures gradually evolved in response to both internal development and external pressures from Rome. Larger tribal confederations began forming, led by kings who claimed authority over multiple smaller tribes. These early kingdoms represented the first steps toward the larger political entities that would eventually become medieval German duchies and principalities. Germanic material culture during this period shows remarkable sophistication, particularly in metalworking and craftsmanship. Archaeological sites have yielded elaborate jewelry, weapons, and household items that demonstrate both technical skill and artistic sensibility. The Germanic peoples were particularly renowned for their work in bronze and iron, creating weapons and tools that were highly prized throughout northern Europe. The linguistic landscape of early Germanic territories was complex, with numerous dialects and related languages spoken across the region. These early Germanic languages would eventually evolve into the various German dialects we know today, as well as related languages like English, Dutch, and the Scandinavian languages. The lack of written Germanic languages during this early period means that most of our knowledge comes from Roman sources and later archaeological evidence. Trade networks connected Germanic tribes across vast distances, with amber from the Baltic coast reaching as far south as the Mediterranean, while Mediterranean goods found their way north to Germanic settlements. These trade routes followed river valleys and mountain passes, creating the foundation for the commercial networks that would later prove so important to medieval German prosperity. The social structure of Germanic tribes was hierarchical but relatively fluid, with opportunities for individuals to rise in status through military prowess, successful leadership, or exceptional skill in crafts or trade. This social mobility would become a characteristic feature of later German society, contributing to the dynamic and innovative culture that would emerge in subsequent centuries. As the Roman Empire entered its later phases, Germanic tribes began to play increasingly important roles in Roman military and political affairs. Some Germanic leaders rose to high positions within the Roman administration, while Germanic warriors formed the backbone of later Roman armies. This integration would prove crucial during the eventual transformation of the Roman world into the early medieval European kingdoms. The geographic foundation that these early Germanic peoples established would prove remarkably enduring. Their settlement patterns, trade routes, and cultural boundaries would influence German development for centuries to come. The tribal territories they established often became the basis for later medieval duchies, while their trade networks evolved into the commercial routes that would make Germany a centre of European commerce. By the end of this early period, the stage was set for the dramatic transformations that would come with the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of new Germanic kingdoms. The geographic advantages of the German lands, combined with the sophisticated societies that Germanic tribes had developed, created the conditions for Germany to emerge as one of the most important regions in medieval Europe. The ancient foundations were firmly in place, ready to support the remarkable historical drama that would unfold in the centuries to come. Chapter 2: Holy Roman Empire to Medieval Glory. As we drift forward through the centuries, imagine the Germanic tribal lands we've explored transforming into something much grander, like watching a collection of small villages slowly bloom into a magnificent medieval metropolis. The stage was perfectly set for one of history's most ambitious political experiments, the Holy Roman Empire, which, despite its rather grandiose name, turned out to be exactly as complex and contradictory as it sounds. The transformation began with a man whose name has become synonymous with medieval European power, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, depending on whether you prefer your historical figures in French or English translation. Born around 747, Charlemagne inherited the Frankish throne in 768 and immediately set about expanding his kingdom with the kind of methodical determination that would make modern project managers weep with envy. Charlemagne's empire grew through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic marriage alliances, and what medieval chroniclers politely called missionary work, though this often involved rather more swords than sermons. His campaigns against the Saxon tribes proved particularly challenging, lasting over 30 years and involving the kind of back-and-forth warfare that must have been exhausting for everyone involved. The Saxons, led by the charismatic chieftain Widukind, proved remarkably stubborn about maintaining their independence and traditional religious practices. The geographic scope of Charlemagne's conquests was breathtaking for its time. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees in the south to the Danish border in the north, from the Atlantic coast of France to the Elbe River in eastern Germany. To put this in perspective, Charlemagne ruled over territory that included most of modern France, western Germany, northern Italy, and parts of Spain, creating the largest political entity in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. On Christmas Day 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, officially reviving the concept of a Western European empire. This coronation was supposedly a surprise to Charlemagne, though historians suspect he was about as surprised as someone who has been planning a surprise party for themselves for several months. The ceremony created what would later become known as the Holy Roman Empire, though it wouldn't acquire that specific name for several more centuries. Charlemagne's administrative genius lay not just in conquest but in organisation. He divided his vast empire into counties and duchies, appointing trusted nobles as administrators who owed their positions to imperial favour rather than hereditary right. This system created a balance between central authority and local administration that proved remarkably durable. His famous capitularies, detailed legal documents that regulated everything from trade practices to monastery management, demonstrate an attention to bureaucratic detail that would impress modern civil servants. The emperor also launched what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a cultural revival that emphasized education, scholarship, and the preservation of classical learning. Charlemagne himself was reportedly illiterate, but possessed an insatiable curiosity about learning and surrounded himself with scholars from across Europe. The development of Carolingian minuscule, a standardized writing system, revolutionized document production and made administrative efficiency possible across the empire's diverse linguistic regions. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind an empire that seemed destined for greatness but faced the eternal medieval problem of succession. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited the throne but lacked his father's military prowess and political acumen. The empire gradually fractured through civil wars between Louis's sons, eventually splitting into three parts through the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The eastern portion of Charlemagne's empire, roughly corresponding to modern Germany, became the Kingdom of East Francia under Louis the German. This eastern kingdom inherited the geographic advantages we discussed earlier: the fertile northern plains, navigable rivers, and strategic position at the crossroads of European trade routes. However, it also inherited a complex patchwork of tribal duchies, each with their own traditions, laws, and ambitions for independence. The stem duchies, as historians call them, formed the backbone of medieval German political organization. Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, and Lotharingia each maintained distinct identities rooted in ancient tribal territories. The Duke of Bavaria controlled the fertile lands around the Danube and the Alpine approaches to Italy. The Duke of Saxony ruled the northern plains and commanded the fierce Saxon warriors who had once resisted Charlemagne so stubbornly. Franconia, centered around the main river valley, controlled crucial trade routes between north and south. These duchies operated as semi-independent kingdoms within the larger framework of the East Frankish realm. Each duke maintained his own court, issued his own laws, and controlled his own military forces. The king ruled through a complex web of personal relationships, land grants, and mutual obligations that formed the foundation of medieval feudalism. This system worked beautifully when everyone agreed on their mutual interests and completely fell apart when they didn't, which happened with predictable regularity. The geographic distribution of these duchies reflected both natural boundaries and historical tribal territories. Swabia controlled the southwestern regions, including the Black Forest and the approaches to Switzerland. Lotharingia, stretching along the Rhine and Moselle valleys, connected the German lands with France and the Low Countries. The duchy boundaries often followed river valleys or mountain ranges, creating natural defensive positions while facilitating internal trade and communication. In 911, the last Carolingian ruler of East Francia, Louis the Child, died without an heir, creating a succession crisis that would fundamentally reshape German political development. Rather than accepting rule from the surviving Carolingian line in France, the German dukes elected one of their own, Conrad of Franconia, as king. This election established the principle that the German crown was not hereditary but elective, a decision that would have profound consequences for centuries to come. Conrad proved ineffective at managing the ambitious dukes, particularly Henry of Saxony, who essentially ignored royal authority and built up his own independent power base in northern Germany. When Conrad died in 918, he famously recommended that the crown should go to his rival Henry rather than his own brother, recognizing that effective leadership mattered more than dynastic continuity. This surprisingly gracious gesture established a precedent for practical politics over strict hereditary succession. Henry the Fowler, as he became known, proved far more successful than his predecessor at managing ducal ambitions and external threats. His reign saw the beginning of German expansion eastward into Slavic territories, a process that would continue for centuries and fundamentally alter the ethnic and cultural composition of Central Europe. Henry also established the principle of Saxon dominance in German politics, beginning what historians call the Ottonian dynasty. Henry's son Otto succeeded him in 936 and proved even more ambitious than his father. Otto the Great, as he would become known, spent his reign systematically reducing the power of the dukes while expanding German influence southward into Italy. His methods combined military force, strategic marriages, and ecclesiastical appointments in a careful balance that demonstrated remarkable political sophistication. The geographic scope of Otto's ambitions became clear when he launched repeated campaigns into Italy, seeking to claim the imperial crown that had lain vacant since the collapse of the Carolingian line. His interventions in Italian politics were motivated partly by prestige, but also by practical concerns about controlling the Alpine passes that connected Germany with the Mediterranean trade networks. In 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto as emperor, formally reviving the Western Roman Empire and creating what historians consider the true beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. This coronation established a precedent that would endure for 8 centuries. German kings would seek imperial coronation in Rome, linking German political ambitions with Italian territories and papal politics in ways that would prove both advantageous and problematic. Otto's imperial ambitions required a fundamental reorganization of German administration. He strengthened royal control by appointing bishops and abbots to administrative positions, creating what historians call the imperial church system. These ecclesiastical administrators owed their positions to royal favour and could not pass their offices to hereditary heirs, making them theoretically more reliable than secular nobles. In practice, this system created new complexities as church officials developed their own political agendas. The reign of Otto's successors saw the gradual emergence of what would become characteristic features of medieval German politics. The emperor's authority depended on a complex balance between different interest groups. The dukes, the bishops, the emerging merchant classes in the cities, and the lesser nobility who served as knights and administrators. This balance required constant attention and frequent military campaigns to maintain royal prestige and authority. Medieval Germany's economic foundation began to shift during this period from purely agricultural production toward commercial exchange. The growth of towns and cities created new centres of wealth and political influence that existed somewhat outside the traditional feudal hierarchy. Cities like Cologne, Magdeburg, and Regensburg became important commercial and administrative centres, their prosperity based on river trade and craft production rather than agricultural land ownership. The development of medieval German Christianity played a crucial role in political organisation. Monasteries served as agricultural innovators, educational institutions, and economic centres. Great Benedictine abbeys controlled vast estates and provided education for both clergy and administrators. Their geographic distribution reflected strategic placement at river crossings, mountain passes, and defensive positions, creating networks that transcended political boundaries. The emergence of the Hanseatic League during this period represents one of medieval Germany's most innovative developments. Beginning as merchant associations seeking protection against pirates, these trading networks evolved into formal city alliances. Lübeck, founded in 1143, became the unofficial capital of this merchant confederation that would eventually span from Novgorod to London. The League transformed northern German politics as merchant cities became autonomous entities capable of conducting their own foreign relations. These Hanseatic towns controlled trade routes connecting Baltic amber and Russian furs with Flemish textiles and English wool, creating Europe's first truly international commercial network. Their wealth often exceeded that of traditional nobility, representing a new form of urban power based on movable assets rather than landed estates. Medieval German political development during this period can be understood as a constant tension between centralizing and decentralizing forces. Strong emperors like Otto the Great or Frederick Barbarossa could impose their will on the duchies and maintain imperial authority. Weak emperors found themselves ignored or actively opposed by ambitious dukes, bishops, and city councils who pursued their own interests without regard for imperial policy. The geographic extent of the Holy Roman Empire by the 12th century encompassed not only the German duchies but also northern Italy, Burgundy, and Bohemia. This vast territory contained enormous cultural and linguistic diversity. German speakers in the north and east, Romance speakers in the south and west, Slavic populations in Bohemia and along the eastern frontiers. Managing this diversity required administrative flexibility and cultural sensitivity that imperial government often lacked. The development of medieval German law during this period reflected the tension between local customs and imperial authority. Each duchy maintained its own legal traditions, often based on ancient tribal practices, while imperial law sought to create uniform standards across the empire. The result was a complex layering of legal systems that varied significantly from region to region. Educational developments in medieval Germany centered around cathedral schools and monastic institutions. The school of Chartres, though technically in France, attracted German students and influenced German intellectual development. Closer to home, the cathedral school at Magdeburg and the monastery at Fulda became centres of learning that trained both clergy and secular administrators. This educational infrastructure would later prove crucial for the administrative sophistication that enabled German expansion and political development. The agricultural foundation of medieval German prosperity underwent significant innovation during this period. The three-field system increased productivity by allowing 1/3 of agricultural land to lie fallow each year, while maintaining continuous cultivation. New ploughing techniques and the development of the heavy-wheeled plough made it possible to cultivate the heavy clay soils of northern Germany more effectively than earlier methods. Climate change during the medieval warm period, roughly from 900 to 1300, significantly improved agricultural conditions across northern Europe. Warmer temperatures allowed cultivation at higher altitudes and latitudes, expanding the amount of arable land available for settlement. This climatic improvement supported population growth that provided both agricultural labour and military manpower for German expansion eastward. The eastward expansion of German settlement during this period fundamentally altered Central European demographics. German settlers brought legal customs, agricultural techniques, and urban planning to regions previously dominated by Slavic peoples. The crusading movement and foundation of the Teutonic Knights during the Third Crusade created military religious organizations that would shape German expansion along the Baltic coast for centuries. By the end of this medieval period, the Holy Roman Empire had established its defining characteristics: elective monarchy, territorial fragmentation, and the complex balance between imperial and local authority. These foundations would shape German political development for the next 6 centuries, creating both the strengths and weaknesses that would define the empire's remarkable longevity and ultimate limitations. Chapter 3: Fragmentation to Unification. As we emerge from the medieval glory days of the Holy Roman Empire, imagine watching a magnificent cathedral slowly crumble over centuries, its stones scattered across a vast landscape, only to have an ambitious architect arrive centuries later to rebuild something entirely different from the fragments. This is essentially the story of German political development, from the devastating 30 Years' War through to Bismarck's masterful unification in 1871. The 30 Years' War, spanning from 1618 to 1648, stands as one of the most catastrophic events in German history, transforming the empire's political landscape as thoroughly as a natural disaster reshapes geography. What began as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states escalated into a continental war that used German lands as its primary battlefield, with devastating consequences that would echo for centuries. The geographic scope of the devastation was staggering. Armies crisscrossed the German territories like deadly weather systems, leaving destruction in their wake. Contemporary accounts describe entire regions reduced to virtual wilderness, with villages abandoned, fields left fallow, and trade routes severed. The infamous sack of Magdeburg in 1631, where Imperial forces destroyed one of Germany's most prosperous cities, became a symbol of the war's brutality and the fragility of urban civilization when armies lived off the land. The demographic impact was equally severe, with historians estimating that Germany lost between 15 and 40% of its population through warfare, disease, and famine. Some regions, particularly in central Germany, experienced population declines that took generations to recover. The war created a peculiar military ecosystem where unpaid mercenary armies became essentially mobile predatory communities, supporting themselves through systematic plunder of the countryside they were supposedly protecting. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 finally ended this nightmare, but its political consequences proved as significant as the war itself. The treaty formally recognized the sovereignty of individual German princes, effectively transforming the Holy Roman Empire from a potentially centralized state into a collection of independent principalities held together by increasingly meaningless ceremonial bonds. The emperor retained his title but lost most practical authority over the empire's constituent territories. This territorial fragmentation created what historians call the German problem, a region of enormous economic and cultural potential divided into hundreds of competing political entities, each jealously guarding its independence. Some territories were so small that their rulers could literally walk across their domains in an afternoon, yet they maintained separate currencies, customs policies, and legal systems. This political atomization made coordinated action nearly impossible and left Germany vulnerable to manipulation by larger neighbours. While most German territories remained weak and fragmented, two emerged as major European powers, Austria and Prussia. Austria, centred in Vienna, controlled vast territories extending into Hungary, Bohemia, and northern Italy. The Austrian Habsburgs maintained their hold on the imperial title and positioned themselves as guardians of Catholic conservative tradition. Their diverse empire included Germans, Magyars, Czechs, Slavs, and Italians, making them a European rather than specifically German power. Prussia's rise from relative insignificance to great power status represents one of the most remarkable political transformations in European history. Originally centered around Berlin and Brandenburg, Prussia expanded through strategic marriages, military conquest, and diplomatic maneuvering to control territories stretching from the Rhine to the borders of Poland. The key to Prussian success lay not in natural resources or favourable geography, but in administrative efficiency and military innovation. Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, began Prussia's transformation during the latter stages of the 30 Years' War. Inheriting scattered territories with no natural unity, he created a centralized administration and standing army that could defend and integrate his diverse holdings. His policies attracted Protestant refugees from religious persecution elsewhere in Europe, particularly Huguenots from France, who brought valuable skills and capital to Prussian territories. The elevation of Prussia to kingdom status in 1701 marked its emergence as a major player in European politics. Frederick I's coronation was carefully orchestrated to avoid offending the Holy Roman Emperor, taking place in Königsberg rather than Berlin, and using the title King in Prussia rather than King of Prussia. These diplomatic niceties reflected the complex political realities of the empire, while establishing Prussia as Austria's primary rival for influence in German affairs. Frederick William I, the Soldier King, transformed Prussia into Europe's most efficient military state. His famous comment that Prussia is not a country with an army, but an army with a country, captured the unique character of the Prussian system. Every aspect of government focused on supporting military efficiency, from tax collection to education to social organization. This militaristic culture produced remarkable results, but also created social tensions that would influence German political development for centuries. Frederick the Great epitomized Prussian ambitions and contradictions. Intellectually sophisticated, fluent in French, and corresponding with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, he simultaneously pursued aggressive military expansion that established Prussia as a major European power. His conquest of Silesia from Austria in 1740 demonstrated that Prussia could challenge the traditional Habsburg dominance in German affairs, fundamentally altering the balance of power within the empire. The 7 Years' War established Prussia's reputation as a military power capable of surviving against overwhelming odds. Frederick's ability to maintain Prussian independence while fighting Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden simultaneously created legendary status for Prussian military prowess. This reputation would prove crucial in later efforts to unite Germany under Prussian leadership, as smaller German states developed confidence that Prussia could protect their interests against foreign threats. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars created both crisis and opportunity for German political development. The revolution's ideological challenge to traditional monarchy initially alarmed all German rulers, but Napoleon's subsequent military successes forced them to choose between cooperation and destruction. His systematic reorganization of German territories eliminated hundreds of small states and created larger, more viable political entities better suited to modern administration. Napoleon's creation of the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806 delivered the final blow to the Holy Roman Empire's already tenuous authority. 16 German princes formally withdrew from the empire to join this French-sponsored confederation, prompting Emperor Francis II to abdicate his imperial title rather than rule over an empty shell. The empire that had existed for nearly 1,000 years simply dissolved, leaving German political identity in crisis. The Confederation of the Rhine represented more than political reorganization. It introduced modern administrative practices, legal codes, and economic policies that would outlast Napoleon's empire. The French Civil Code provided a uniform legal framework, replacing the bewildering complexity of traditional German law. Administrative efficiency improved dramatically as professional bureaucrats replaced feudal administrators and internal trade barriers were reduced or eliminated. These reforms also awakened German national consciousness in ways their creators never intended. The experience of French domination created shared grievances that transcended traditional territorial loyalties. German intellectuals like Johann Gottlieb Fichte began articulating concepts of German cultural and political unity that went beyond mere resistance to foreign occupation. The Wars of Liberation became the first truly German national movement, uniting people across regional boundaries in common cause. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 attempted to create a stable post-Napoleonic order, while accommodating the legitimate interests of all major powers. For Germany, this meant creating the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states under Austrian presidency. This arrangement satisfied Austrian desires to maintain influence while avoiding the creation of a powerful unified German state that might threaten European balance. The German Confederation represented a compromise that pleased no one completely. German nationalists wanted genuine unity, while conservatives feared that any movement toward unification might unleash democratic forces that would threaten monarchical authority. The Confederation's weak institutions could only function when all major members agreed, which meant that Austria and Prussia could paralyze the system whenever their interests diverged. Economic forces began driving German integration despite political obstacles. The Zollverein, or customs union, initiated by Prussia in 1834, created a free trade area that eventually included most German states except Austria. This economic integration demonstrated the practical benefits of cooperation, while gradually accustoming German merchants and manufacturers to thinking in broader geographic terms than their immediate principalities. The development of railway networks accelerated this process by creating physical connections between previously isolated regions. The first German railway, built between Nuremberg and Fürth in 1835, initiated a transportation revolution that would transform both economic relationships and political consciousness. Railways made it possible to think of Germany as a single economic space, while creating constituencies with interests in maintaining and expanding these connections. The Revolution of 1848 represented the high water mark of liberal German nationalism. The Frankfurt Parliament's attempt to create a democratic German constitution revealed fundamental disagreements about Austrian inclusion and whether unification should come through popular sovereignty or monarchical initiative. When King Frederick William IV of Prussia rejected the imperial crown offered by the Assembly, declaring he would not accept a crown from the gutter, the liberal movement's weakness became apparent. Otto von Bismarck emerged as the solution to Germany's political crisis, though his approach differed dramatically from liberal expectations. Appointed Prussian minister-president in 1862 during a constitutional crisis over military spending, Bismarck demonstrated his willingness to govern without parliamentary approval, while pursuing policies that would ultimately satisfy nationalist aspirations through distinctly non-democratic means. Bismarck's famous declaration that Germany's great questions would be decided by blood and iron rather than speeches and majority decisions captured his realistic assessment of European power politics. He understood that German unification required military victory over those who opposed it, particularly Austria and France, and that such victories required military preparations that liberal parliaments were reluctant to fund. The Danish War of 1864 provided Bismarck with his first opportunity to demonstrate how military success could advance German unity. The conflict over Schleswig-Holstein created an issue where Prussian and Austrian interests initially aligned, allowing them to cooperate in defeating Denmark while positioning Prussia to claim the larger share of the spoils. The war's successful conclusion enhanced Prussian prestige, while creating territorial disputes that would later justify conflict with Austria. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 represented the decisive struggle for leadership of the German states. Bismarck carefully isolated Austria diplomatically, while ensuring that most German states would support Prussia in the conflict. His alliance with Italy forced Austria to fight on two fronts, while his understanding with Napoleon III neutralized potential French intervention. The war's outcome at Königgrätz established Prussian supremacy in German affairs while excluding Austria from future German political development. The creation of the North German Confederation after the Austrian defeat demonstrated Bismarck's political genius in combining conservative methods with nationalist goals. The Confederation provided genuine unity for northern German states, while preserving monarchical authority and Prussian dominance. Its constitution balanced democratic elements, like universal male suffrage for the Reichstag, with conservative safeguards, such as Prussian control over the presidency and military command. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 provided the final catalyst for German unification by creating a shared external threat that overcomes southern German reluctance to join a Prussian-dominated union. Bismarck's skillful editing of the Ems dispatch provoked French declarations of war that made France appear the aggressor, enabling him to invoke defensive alliances with southern German states that brought them into the conflict on Prussia's side. The war's dramatic success exceeded all expectations, with German forces defeating French armies, capturing Napoleon III, and besieging Paris itself. These victories generated enormous enthusiasm throughout German territories and provided irrefutable proof of the benefits of unity. When German princes proclaimed Wilhelm I as German Emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on January 18, 1871, they were acknowledging political realities that military success had made undeniable. The new German Empire represented a masterpiece of political engineering that satisfied diverse constituencies while maintaining essential Prussian dominance. The federal structure preserved traditional monarchies while creating effective central authority. The industrial regions of the Rhineland and Saxony gained access to larger markets and political influence commensurate with their economic importance. Prussia retained control over the military and foreign policy while accepting constitutional limitations on domestic governance. The geographic extent of the new empire reflected both historical German settlement patterns and recent military conquests. The inclusion of Alsace-Lorraine, seized from France, provided strategic depth and valuable industrial resources while creating a permanent source of Franco-German tension. The empire's population of over 40 million included significant minorities of Poles, Danes, and French, who had not chosen German citizenship but found themselves incorporated through territorial transfers. This unification represented the culmination of centuries of German political fragmentation and the beginning of Germany's emergence as Europe's dominant power. The efficiency of Prussian administration, combined with the economic dynamism of German industry, created a state capable of challenging the existing European balance of power. The speed and completeness of German success surprised even its architects and established the Second Reich as the focal point of European diplomacy for the next half-century. Chapter 4: Imperial Ambitions to World Wars. The newly unified German Empire of 1871 must have seemed like a political miracle to contemporary observers, rather like watching someone successfully assemble a complex machine from scattered parts, using nothing but determination and strategic hammering. Yet this remarkable achievement contained within it the seeds of two catastrophic world wars that would devastate not only Germany, but reshape the entire global order. The German Empire that emerged from Bismarck's wars was an impressive but unstable creation, stretching from the Rhine to the borders of Russia, encompassing over 65 million people. It combined the administrative efficiency of Prussia with the industrial dynamism of regions like the Rhineland and Silesia. The empire's federal structure attempted to balance unity with diversity, allowing traditional monarchies to maintain their dignity while ensuring Prussian dominance over crucial matters like foreign policy and military affairs. Geographically, the new empire enjoyed considerable advantages. The inclusion of Alsace-Lorraine provided access to valuable iron ore deposits that, combined with coal from the Ruhr Valley, created ideal conditions for industrial development. The empire controlled major European river systems, extensive coastlines on both the North and Baltic Seas, and possessed a central position that made it the natural hub for continental trade and transportation networks. However, This geographic position proved double-edged. Germany's location at the heart of Europe meant that any conflict involving German interests would likely engage multiple neighbours simultaneously. The empire lacked the geographic insularity that protected Britain, or the vast continental buffer zones that benefited Russia and America. German security required either the friendship of neighbours or the military strength to deter their combined opposition. Kaiser Wilhelm I, the empire's first emperor, maintained the cautious foreign policy that Bismarck had designed to prevent exactly this kind of encirclement. The Iron Chancellor understood that Germany's sudden emergence as Europe's most powerful state had alarmed other powers, particularly France, which nursed dreams of revenge for the losses of 1871. His diplomatic system aimed to isolate France while maintaining cordial relations with Austria, Russia, and Britain. Wilhelm II's accession to the throne in 1888 marked a dramatic shift in German policy. Young, impetuous, and convinced of his divine right to rule, the new Kaiser dismissed Bismarck in 1890 and embarked on what he called a new course in German policy. This new direction emphasized German prestige, naval expansion, and a more assertive approach to international relations that Bismarck would have considered dangerously provocative. The Kaiser's decision to build a powerful German navy represented a fundamental challenge to British naval supremacy. The construction of dreadnought battleships in German yards sent unmistakable signals that Germany intended to compete with Britain for control of the seas. This naval rivalry transformed what had been a generally friendly relationship between the two Germanic powers into increasingly suspicious competition that would have profound consequences for European stability. Germany's rapid industrial growth during this period was genuinely remarkable, transforming the empire into Europe's leading industrial power by the early 20th century. German steel production exceeded that of Britain and France combined, while German chemical and electrical industries led the world in innovation and efficiency. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Essen became symbols of modern industrial civilization, their rapid growth attracting workers from across the empire and creating new social dynamics. This economic success, however, created political tensions that the empire's constitution struggled to manage. The growing industrial working class, organized in powerful trade unions and represented by the Social Democratic Party, challenged traditional hierarchies and demanded political participation that the Prussian establishment found threatening. The empire's rapid modernization created social strains between traditional rural elites and emergent urban masses that would prove difficult to reconcile. The July crisis of 1914 transformed these underlying tensions into continental catastrophe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo provided Austria-Hungary with an excuse to settle accounts with Serbia, but the crisis escalated beyond anyone's initial expectations. Germany's decision to support Austria unconditionally, combined with the alliance systems that Bismarck's successors had failed to manage effectively, turned a regional conflict into a world war. Germany's war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, reflected both the empire's geographic vulnerabilities and its military confidence. Designed to avoid the dreaded two-front war by quickly defeating France before turning against Russia, the plan required violating Belgian neutrality and defeating the French army in 6 weeks. The plan's failure at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914 doomed Germany to exactly the prolonged, multi-front conflict that German strategy had sought to avoid. The geography of the Western Front reflected the fundamental realities of modern warfare rather than traditional military strategy. The line of trenches that stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland created a deadlock that neither side could break despite enormous sacrifices. German forces found themselves fighting defensive battles while their enemies controlled the seas, gradually tightening a blockade that would prove more decisive than any individual battle. Germany's initial military successes in the east, including the spectacular victory at Tannenberg, demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of German military organization and tactical innovation. However, these victories came at the cost of resources needed on the Western Front, and the vast distances involved in Eastern European operations stretched German logistics beyond their breaking point. The Empire lacked the manpower and material resources to sustain simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts. The British naval blockade gradually transformed German society as much as any military defeat. By 1916, German civilians were experiencing severe food shortages that would only worsen as the war continued. The infamous turnip winter of 1916-17 saw German families reduced to eating ersatz foods and substitutes that barely provided adequate nutrition. The blockade's effects undermined both military morale and civilian support for the war effort. Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 represented a desperate gamble to break the deadlock. The German Navy hoped submarine attacks would force Britain to seek peace before American intervention could tip the balance. Instead, this policy brought the United States into the conflict while failing to achieve decisive results, creating the worst possible outcome for German strategy. The final German offensives of 1918 consumed Germany's remaining reserves without achieving decisive results. When Allied counterattacks began in August, German forces lacked resources to maintain defensive lines. The collapse of Germany's allies exposed the Empire's isolated position, and by November, Germany faced the combined opposition of nearly the entire world. The German Revolution of November 1918 reflected both war weariness and the collapse of traditional authority. Naval mutinies at Kiel spread rapidly to other cities, creating workers' and soldiers' councils that challenged imperial authority. Kaiser Wilhelm's abdication and flight to Holland marked the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty and the empire that had lasted less than 50 years. The revolution established the Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democratic government. The Treaty of Versailles, imposed on Germany in 1919, reflected the Allies' determination to prevent German aggression while satisfying their own territorial and economic interests. Germany lost approximately 13% of its territory, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, parts of Prussia to Poland, and all overseas colonies. The treaty limited the German army to 100,000 men, prohibited military aircraft and submarines, and imposed enormous reparations payments that would burden the German economy for decades. The territorial losses fundamentally altered Germany's geographic position in ways that created lasting resentment. The creation of the Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, while the Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations administration. The demilitarization of the Rhineland removed Germany's western defensive barrier, while restrictions on the German military eliminated the empire's traditional source of international influence. The Weimar Republic inherited an impossible situation: a defeated nation, fragile democracy, economic devastation, and territorial losses most Germans considered unjust. The new government faced challenges from communist revolutionaries and right-wing paramilitaries, while hyperinflation destroyed middle-class savings and undermined confidence in democratic institutions. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 demonstrated the Republic's vulnerability to economic shock. The government's decision to print money to pay reparations and support passive resistance in the occupied Ruhr created a monetary collapse so complete that German currency became literally worthless. Middle-class families saw their life savings evaporate overnight, while workers needed wheelbarrows to carry enough cash for daily purchases. This crisis destroyed faith in democratic governance among precisely those social groups whose support democracy required. The brief period of stability from 1924 to 1929, known as the Golden Years of the Weimar Republic, showed what German democracy might have achieved under better circumstances. American loans helped stabilize the currency, industrial production recovered to pre-war levels, and cultural innovation flourished in cities like Berlin. However, this prosperity depended on foreign investment and international cooperation that would prove fragile when economic conditions deteriorated. The Great Depression struck Germany with particular severity, exposing the underlying weaknesses of the Weimar system. Unemployment rose to over 6 million by 1932, while political paralysis prevented effective government action. The Depression created conditions in which extremist parties could appeal to desperate voters seeking simple solutions to complex problems. Both the Communist Party and the Nazi Party gained support as democratic institutions appeared increasingly ineffective. Adolf Hitler's rise to power represented the culmination of democracy's failure rather than the result of popular enthusiasm for fascism. The Nazi Party never received more than 37% of the vote in free elections, but the fragmentation of democratic parties and the miscalculations of conservative politicians who thought they could control Hitler enabled his appointment as Chancellor in January 1933. Within months, he had transformed the chancellorship into a dictatorship and begun implementing the policies that would lead to another world war. Nazi Germany's geographic ambitions far exceeded those of the previous German Empire, reflecting Hitler's racial ideology and his concept of Lebensraum, or living space. The Nazi program called for German expansion throughout Eastern Europe, the enslavement or extermination of Slavic populations, and the creation of a continental empire that would dominate Europe for generations. These goals required aggressive war and genocidal policies that went far beyond traditional territorial disputes. The Nazi rearmament program transformed Germany from a disarmed nation into Europe's most powerful military force within a decade. The reintroduction of conscription, the construction of massive armament factories, and the development of new military technologies created employment while preparing for war. The Autobahn system, ostensibly built for civilian transportation, was designed to facilitate rapid military movement across German territory. Hitler's early foreign policy successes convinced many Germans that Nazi methods could restore national greatness without the costs of prolonged conflict. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, and the acquisition of the Sudetenland all achieved territorial gains without serious opposition from Western powers. These bloodless victories created overconfidence that would prove fatal when Germany finally encountered determined resistance. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 demonstrated Germany's military innovations while triggering the wider conflict that Hitler may not have intended at that moment. The combination of tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry that produced blitzkrieg tactics achieved rapid victory over Polish forces, but it also brought Britain and France into the war. Unlike 1914, Germany now faced opposition from powers determined to fight until Nazi Germany was completely defeated. The early German victories of 1940 seemed to vindicate Nazi methods. The conquest of Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France within months established German hegemony over continental Europe. These victories, however, masked fundamental weaknesses that would become apparent when Germany faced more resilient opponents. The failure to defeat Britain forced Germany into extended conflict. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 achieved massive initial successes but failed to destroy the Soviet Union before winter, committing Germany to prolonged Eastern War while still facing British opposition. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States completed the coalition that would eventually defeat Nazi Germany through overwhelming material superiority. The Holocaust represented Nazi Germany's most horrific achievement, the systematic murder of European Jews and other targeted populations using modern industrial methods. The construction of extermination camps, the development of killing technologies, and the bureaucratic organization of genocide demonstrated how advanced civilization could be turned to barbaric purposes. The Holocaust forever linked German nationalism with genocidal racism in ways that would shape post-war German identity. The German defeat of 1945 was more complete than any in the nation's previous history. Allied forces occupied all German territory. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, and the Nazi state simply disintegrated. The destruction of German cities, the displacement of German populations, and the division of Germany itself represented consequences far more severe than those imposed in 1918. This time, there would be no question about who had won or lost the war. Chapter 5: Division and Cold War Geography. In the aftermath of total defeat in 1945, Germany found itself in a situation rather like a broken clock being disassembled by 4 different repair shops, each with completely different ideas about how timepieces should work and what time they should display. What began as a temporary administrative arrangement to manage the defeated Nazi state evolved into one of the most dramatic examples of how ideological differences can literally reshape geography. The Allied occupation of Germany reflected both the completeness of German defeat and the emerging tensions among the victorious powers. Unlike previous conflicts where defeated nations might retain some sovereignty while paying reparations, Nazi Germany simply ceased to exist as a political entity. The Allies assumed complete control over German territory through the Allied Control Council, treating the country as conquered territory without a legitimate government. The division of Germany into 4 occupation zones followed agreements reached at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, though the specific boundaries reflected military realities as much as diplomatic planning. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern third of Germany, while American, British, and French forces divided the western 2/3 among themselves. This arrangement placed approximately 24 million Germans under Soviet administration and 41 million under Western control. Berlin presented unique complications as a city located entirely within the Soviet zone yet divided among all 4 occupying powers. The former Nazi capital, reduced to rubble by bombing and street fighting, became a microcosm of larger Allied disagreements about Germany's future. Each power administered its Berlin sector according to its own policies, while theoretically cooperating through the Allied Kommandatura, an arrangement that worked about as smoothly as one might expect from former enemies with fundamentally different worldviews. The geographic consequences of defeat extended far beyond occupation zones. Germany lost approximately 25% of its pre-war territory through the Oder-Neisse line, which transferred historically German lands to Poland and the Soviet Union. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania regions that had been German for centuries became permanently foreign territory. Over 12 million ethnic Germans fled or were expelled from these areas in one of the largest population movements in European history. These territorial losses fundamentally altered Germany's geographic identity. The country that had once extended from the Rhine to East Prussia now found itself compressed into a much smaller space, while millions of refugees crowded into the remaining territory. The loss of agricultural lands in the east, combined with the destruction of industrial infrastructure, created immediate challenges for feeding and housing the surviving population. The initial Allied policy of deindustrialization, designed to prevent future German aggression, soon collided with practical realities. The Morgenthau Plan's vision of transforming Germany into an agricultural society proved both economically impossible and strategically counterproductive as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated. Western leaders realized that German recovery was essential not only for European economic stability, but also for containing Soviet influence. The economic integration of the Western zones began with practical cooperation, but gradually evolved into political unity. The creation of Bosonia in 1947 merged American and British zones for administrative efficiency, while the inclusion of the French zone in 1949 created Trizonia. These economic arrangements established patterns of cooperation that would eventually become the foundation for West German statehood. The Berlin blockade of 1948-49 demonstrated both the vulnerability of the Western position and the determination to maintain it. Stalin's decision to cut off land access to West Berlin aimed to force Western withdrawal from the city, but the Berlin airlift proved that Western powers could supply their sectors by air. The successful delivery of over 2 million tons of supplies by aircraft showed Germans that their former enemies were now committed to their survival and freedom. The formation of separate German states in 1949 formalized the division that had been developing since the war's end. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in the Western zones with Bonn as its capital, adopted a democratic constitution and market economy. The German Democratic Republic, created in the Soviet zone with East Berlin as its capital, implemented a socialist system based on the Soviet model. Both states initially claimed to represent all of Germany, while ruling only portions of it. The geographic and political contrasts between East and West Germany became apparent almost immediately. West Germany benefited from Marshall Plan aid, which provided capital for reconstruction and modernization. The introduction of the Deutsche Mark in 1948 created a stable currency that facilitated economic recovery. By contrast, East Germany faced massive Soviet demands for reparations, which stripped away industrial equipment and hampered reconstruction efforts. The Korean War unexpectedly accelerated West German recovery by creating global demand for manufactured goods, just as German industry was regaining productive capacity. The economic miracle, or Wirtschaftswunder, transformed West Germany from a devastated, defeated nation into one of Europe's most prosperous societies within a decade. Rising living standards, full employment, and consumer abundance demonstrated the appeal of democratic capitalism to Germans on both sides of the divide. East Germany's development followed a different trajectory, emphasizing heavy industry and collective agriculture over consumer goods. The Socialist Unity Party, formed through the forced merger of Social Democrats and Communists, implemented 5-year plans designed to build a socialist economy. While these policies achieved industrial growth in some sectors, they failed to match West German prosperity or provide the consumer goods that citizens increasingly desired. The flow of refugees from East to West Germany created an ongoing crisis for the communist state. Nearly 3 million East Germans fled to the West between 1949 and 1961, representing approximately 20% of the population. This exodus included many skilled workers, professionals, and young people whose departure threatened the viability of the East German economy and social system. Berlin became the primary escape route for East Germans seeking freedom, since the city's four-power status maintained relatively open borders between sectors. East Germans could travel to East Berlin and simply walk or take public transportation to West Berlin, from where they could fly to West Germany. This loophole in the Iron Curtain made Berlin a symbol of Western freedom, while demonstrating the appeal of democratic society to those living under communist rule. The construction of the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961, represented the most dramatic geographic manifestation of ideological division. In a single night, East German forces erected barbed wire barriers that would eventually become a fortified concrete wall completely surrounding West Berlin. The 155-kilometer barrier transformed the city's geography, dividing neighborhoods, separating families, and creating a deadly no-man's land in the heart of Europe. The wall's construction required extraordinary logistical coordination, involving 14,000 East German border guards and construction workers who sealed 81 crossing points between East and West Berlin. Streets were blocked, subway lines severed, and telephone connections cut, Buildings along the border were evacuated and their windows bricked up to prevent escape attempts. The operation succeeded because Western forces, caught off guard, chose not to intervene militarily in what they recognized as Soviet-controlled territory. The human consequences of the wall's construction were immediately apparent, as families found themselves separated by accident of geography. Berliners who had crossed between sectors for work, shopping, or visiting relatives suddenly discovered that their daily routines had become impossible. The wall divided not just a city but also individual lives, creating personal tragedies that would persist for nearly 3 decades. The wall's geography evolved over time from initial barbed wire barriers into a sophisticated border security system. The final version included 2 concrete walls separated by a death strip containing anti-vehicle obstacles, patrol roads, watchtowers, and trained guard dogs. Motion detectors, floodlights, and armed guards made escape attempts extremely dangerous, though more than 5,000 people eventually succeeded in crossing to the west through various creative methods. West Berlin's survival as a democratic enclave within East German territory required constant Western commitment and considerable expense. The city's economy depended on subsidies from West Germany, special air corridors for transportation, and the determination of 2 million West Berliners to maintain their freedom despite geographic isolation. The presence of Allied garrisons provided security guarantees while demonstrating Western resolve to protect democratic values. The contrast between East and West Berlin became increasingly apparent as the years passed. West Berlin maintained its character as a vibrant, prosperous city with modern architecture, abundant consumer goods, and cultural freedom. East Berlin, despite serving as the GDR capital, exhibited the greyness and scarcity typical of communist societies, with limited consumer choices, restricted travel, and omnipresent security apparatus. The role of geography in Cold War Germany extended beyond Berlin to the broader landscape of divided Europe. The Iron Curtain running through Germany created a militarized frontier, where NATO and Warsaw Pact forces faced each other along hundreds of kilometers of fortified border. This division transformed Central European geography, disrupting traditional trade routes, cultural connections, and family relationships that had existed for centuries. The environmental consequences of division included the creation of an accidental nature preserve along the border, where military restrictions prevented human development for 40 years. Wildlife flourished in the no man's land between East and West, creating a green belt that nature conservationists would later celebrate. However, the human costs of this geographic division far outweighed any environmental benefits. Cultural differences between East and West Germany developed over time as the two societies evolved along different paths. West Germans embraced American popular culture, consumerism, and democratic values, while East Germans lived under state socialism that emphasized collective goals over individual desires. These differences became apparent in everything from architecture and urban planning to fashion and entertainment, creating distinct identities despite shared language and heritage. The economic disparities between the two Germanys widened throughout the Cold War period. West Germany's integration into the European Economic Community and NATO provided access to international markets and security guarantees that facilitated prosperity. East Germany's membership in Comecon and the Warsaw Pact tied its economy to the less dynamic Soviet system, while limiting Western contacts that might have promoted innovation and efficiency. Transportation networks reflected and reinforced the division of Germany. West German autobahns connected seamlessly with Western European highway systems, while East German roads served primarily domestic needs with limited international connections except to other Soviet bloc countries. Air travel from Berlin required navigating carefully regulated corridors that could be closed during political crises, making the city's isolation a constant reminder of Cold War tensions. The psychological geography of divided Germany created unique challenges for maintaining German identity and unity. Families separated by the border developed different experiences, values, and expectations over decades of division. Children born after 1961 knew only a divided Germany and had little personal connection to relatives on the other side. The longer division persisted, the more distinct East and West German societies became. The international implications of German division extended far beyond Germany itself. The country's partition served as both symbol and substance of the broader Cold War division of Europe. Changes in German-German relations often reflected shifts in superpower relationships, while crises in Berlin could escalate into global confrontations. The stability of German division became integral to maintaining the broader balance of power that characterized the Cold War system. Despite political division, geographic and cultural factors maintained some connections between East and West Germany. Radio and television broadcasts crossed borders, allowing East Germans to observe Western prosperity and freedom. Family letters and occasional visits maintained personal relationships despite political barriers. These connections would prove crucial when political changes eventually created opportunities for reunification. By the 1980s, the geographic division of Germany had become a permanent feature of European politics, accepted by most observers as the price of peace and stability. The Berlin Wall had evolved from a shocking violation of human rights into a familiar landmark that tourists visited and diplomats navigated. Few imagined that this seemingly permanent division would suddenly collapse, opening possibilities for reunification that had seemed impossible for decades. Chapter 6: Reunification to Modern Germany. By the late 1980s, the Berlin Wall had been standing for nearly 3 decades. East and West Germany seemed as permanent as the Alps themselves. Travel guides listed the wall as a tourist attraction. Politicians spoke of managing division rather than ending it. German families, separated by the border, had grown accustomed to their reality, seeing each other only during carefully controlled visits that felt more like visiting a foreign country than reconnecting with relatives. And then, in the span of less than a year, everything changed in ways nobody predicted. The story begins not in Germany but in Moscow, where a man named Mikhail Gorbachev had become leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev looked at his country's struggling economy and realized something radical needed to change. He introduced policies called glasnost and perestroika, which basically meant openness and restructuring. The Soviet Empire, which had seemed indestructible, was about to discover that once you start allowing a little freedom, it's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Think of it like loosening a cork on a champagne bottle, thinking you'll just release a little pressure, only to have the whole thing explode in your face. By 1989, communist governments across Eastern Europe were wobbling like a house of cards. Poland held semi-free elections. Hungary started dismantling its border fence with Austria. East Germans, watching all this on their televisions, started asking themselves an uncomfortable question: why are we still stuck here? That summer, thousands of East Germans began taking vacations to Hungary and then making a run for the Austrian border, effectively escaping to the west through a loophole in the Iron Curtain. The East German government watched in horror as their citizens voted with their feet. Meanwhile, in East German cities, something remarkable was happening. Every Monday, people in Leipzig began gathering at the Nikolaikirche, a medieval church that suddenly became ground zero for peaceful protests. At first, there were hundreds, then thousands. By October 1989, there were 70,000 people marching through Leipzig, carrying candles and chanting, "We sind das Volk, we are the people." The government prepared the police and military for a crackdown, but something stopped them. Maybe it was the sheer number of protesters. Maybe it was the peaceful nature of the demonstrations, or maybe, just maybe, even the East German authorities sensed that the game was up. On November 9th, 1989, a East German government spokesman named Günter Schabowski held a press conference to announce some minor changes to travel regulations. A reporter asked when the new rules would take effect. Schabowski, clearly confused and not properly briefed, shuffled through his papers and said, "As far as I know, immediately." That was all it took. Within hours, thousands of Berliners converged on the wall's checkpoints. Border guards, having received no clear orders and facing massive crowds, simply opened the gates. People climbed on top of the wall with hammers and pickaxes. Champagne bottles appeared from nowhere. Strangers hugged and cried. The Berlin Wall, which had stood for 28 years and seemed like it would last forever, fell not with a bang, but with a party. The geographic implications were immediate and messy. Suddenly, people could walk freely between East and West Berlin. Those who had been born after the wall went up and had never crossed to the other side wandered through the streets in a daze, seeing their city whole for the first time. East Berliners flooded into West Berlin, where they received 100 Deutschmarks in welcome money and promptly spent it on things they'd never been able to buy. Bananas became oddly symbolic of reunification because they'd been so scarce in the East. The party lasted for days, but the complicated work of actually reunifying Germany was just beginning. Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany saw an opportunity and grabbed it with both hands. In November 1989, just days after the wall fell, he announced a 10-point plan for German reunification. The speed was breathtaking and, frankly, terrified some of Germany's neighbours. Britain and France had spent centuries being invaded by German armies, and the idea of a unified, economically powerful Germany right in the middle of Europe made them nervous. Soviet leader Gorbachev needed to be convinced that a unified Germany wouldn't threaten Soviet security. Negotiations involved everyone from the 2 German states to the 4 Allied powers who still technically had rights in Germany left over from World War II. The solution, reached in the 2+4 agreement of September 1990, was elegant in its simplicity. Germany would reunify as a fully sovereign nation, but it would remain in NATO and the European community. Soviet troops would withdraw from East German territory, and Germany would commit to never developing nuclear weapons and to limiting the size of its military. The geographic borders would be final, no territorial claims on lands lost after World War II. Poland particularly appreciated that last part, since some of its territory had been part of Germany before 1945. On October 3, 1990, East Germany officially ceased to exist. Rather than creating a new country, East Germany simply joined West Germany under the existing West German constitution. 5 new states were created out of East Germany's territory: Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, Brandenburg, Saxony-Anhalt, Saxony, and Thuringia. East Berlin merged with West Berlin to form a single city-state. Geographically, Germany was whole again. Economically and socially, the real challenge was just beginning. The East German economy, it turned out, was in far worse shape than anyone realized. Industries that had seemed functional under communism collapsed almost overnight when they had to compete on the open market. The famous Trabant car became a joke in the West, where people were used to Volkswagens and Mercedes. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. East Germans, who had been promised prosperity through unification, instead found themselves watching their old lives disappear. West Germany poured staggering amounts of money into the East. Estimates range from 1 to 2 trillion euros over the following decades. Entire cities were rebuilt. Infrastructure was modernized. The environmental disasters left by communist-era industries were cleaned up, a process that's still ongoing in some places. Berlin, naturally, became the capital again, though the government didn't fully move there from Bonn until 1999. Reconstructing Berlin involved fascinating geographic and political decisions. Should they rebuild destroyed historic buildings like they had been? Should they embrace modern architecture? Should they preserve pieces of the wall as memorials? The answers varied. The Reichstag, home of the German parliament, got a striking modern glass dome representing governmental transparency. Some sections of the wall were preserved as the East Side Gallery, covered with murals by artists from around the world. Other sections were demolished to make way for gleaming new developments. The social integration proved just as complex as the economic challenges. East and West Germans, despite speaking the same language, discovered they'd developed quite different cultures during their decades of separation. East Germans resented being treated as backward cousins who needed to be taught how things worked. West Germans grew frustrated at the cost of supporting the East. The term Ossi for East Germans and Wessi for West Germans, originally just descriptive, sometimes carried a subtle edge of resentment. Even today, you can sometimes tell which part of Germany someone comes from by their attitudes and assumptions. Modern Germany's geography reflects this complicated history. Drive through eastern Germany and you'll see gleaming wind farms and solar panels. The region has become a leader in renewable energy, but you'll also see abandoned factories and villages where young people have moved away for better opportunities elsewhere. The population distribution remains uneven, with western regions generally more prosperous and populous than eastern ones, though cities like Dresden and Leipzig have experienced impressive revivals. Germany's position at the heart of Europe took on new significance after reunification. When the European Union expanded eastward in the 2000s, Germany literally became the bridge between Western and Eastern Europe. Its central location, which had made it a battlefield in previous centuries, now made it a hub of commerce and communication. 9 countries border Germany, more than any other European nation except Russia. Frankfurt became a financial centre. Hamburg's port connected Germany to global trade. Munich emerged as a high-tech hub. Berlin became a magnet for artists, startups, and anyone seeking affordable space in a major European capital. The European Union itself partly exists as an answer to the German question what to do about a large, powerful country in the middle of Europe. By binding Germany into a network of European institutions, by making it economically interdependent with its neighbours, and by giving it a leadership role that required cooperation rather than domination, Europe found a way to channel German energy and capability into constructive, rather than destructive directions. Germany became the EU's largest economy, and its largest contributor to the EU budget, wielding influence through economics and diplomacy rather than military force. The refugee crisis of 2015 tested this new Germany in unexpected ways. When hundreds of thousands of refugees from Syria and other conflict zones sought entry to Europe, Chancellor Angela Merkel made a decision that defined her legacy. She opened Germany's borders. "Wir schaffen das," she said, "we can manage this." The decision was controversial, sparking debates about German identity and integration that continue today. Angela Merkel herself, who grew up in East Germany and became Germany's first female chancellor in 2005, led the country for 16 years through the global financial crisis, the European debt crisis, and the early stages of the COVID pandemic. Her leadership style, cautious, pragmatic, unflashy, seemed to embody Germany's post-reunification approach to the world. Germany's relationship with its own history remains complex and thoughtful. You won't find German flags flying everywhere like you might in the United States. Expressions of national pride are carefully calibrated, avoiding anything that might evoke the nationalism of the past. Holocaust memorials are prominent and well maintained. School curricula tackle the Nazi period head-on. It's about remembering in a way that prevents repetition. The geographic legacy of division persists in subtle ways. The inner German border zone, once a deadly barrier, is now the Grünsband, the Green Belt, a nature reserve running the length of the former border. Because the border zone was kept clear of development and agriculture for decades, rare plants and animals found refuge there. Now, hikers and cyclists traverse trails along what was once one of the world's most heavily fortified borders. It's a powerful metaphor. Barriers to human connection becoming corridors for natural life. Modern Germany faces challenges that would have seemed unimaginable during the Cold War. Climate change requires transforming the German economy away from fossil fuels. The Energiewende aims to phase out nuclear power and coal in favour of renewables. Germany's automotive industry must reinvent itself for an electric future. The rise of right-wing populism has sparked debates about immigration and identity. Yet Germany has become something its founders after World War II might not have dared imagine. A prosperous, democratic, peaceful country trusted by its neighbours. It's the EU's largest economy and most populous nation. It's a champion of European integration and international cooperation. It welcomes millions of tourists each year to its medieval towns, its Bavarian Alps, its Rhine Valley, and its vibrant cities. Geography still shapes Germany's character, but in different ways than before. The Rhine and Danube still flow as they have for millennia, but now they're spanned by bridges connecting European nations. The North German plain is now covered with wind turbines generating clean energy. The mountain borders now attract skiers and hikers from across Europe. The story of Germany is ultimately a story about geography and choice. The physical landscape has been constant, but what people chose to do with that landscape, how they organized themselves politically, what values they embraced, made all the difference between catastrophe and prosperity, between division and unity. If you visit Germany today, you'll find a country comfortable with its complexity. You can drink beer in Bavaria and attend a techno concert in Berlin. You can visit medieval castles and cutting-edge research facilities. You can see the scars of history-preserved concentration camps, memorial sites, sections of the wall alongside symbols of hope and renewal. So there you have it, Germany, from tribal forests to European powerhouse, from divided nation to unified democracy, from geographic crossroads to political partner. It's been quite a journey through Central European history and geography, full of unexpected twists, terrible tragedies, and ultimately, hope for a better future. The land between the Alps and the North Sea has witnessed empires rise and fall, borders drawn and redrawn, and the constant human struggle to build something lasting and good. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can imagine those Rhine rivers still flowing, those mountain ranges still standing, and millions of people living their lives in a country that chose, finally, democracy and peace over the alternatives. Sleep well, knowing that even history's darkest chapters can have brighter endings.